So in this video, I want to talk about how character in recent decades, not just for fantasy, but honestly media in general, has evolved substantially for the better, in my opinion. Now what I'm talking about is the fact we seem to have evolved out of the totally righteous, manly example of the best of humanity at the time, protagonist, into a more morally gray, conflicted, relatable, human, and understandable protagonist. I was actually inspired to make this video by a recent discussion I had with fellow booktuber Ariel Burgess in a video that's going to be posted in the WoT Artists channel, so shameless plug here, go subscribe if you want to go see us talk about Terry Goodkind and his problem with his writing, protagonist, personality, everything. But what we were discussing is the fact that in recent decades, we seem to have evolved from this idea that protagonists are just the ultimate good, the fantasy fulfillment, and I'm talking fantasy as in like your average person's fantasy, wish fulfillment, to something that's more representative of our consciousness, our conflictions, and is a closer examination of who we are. And this is even the most just mass market blockbusters we see today, like the MCU. Let's compare even superheroes and how they're depicted now versus how they were depicted back in the 40s, 50s, and even prior to that. Captain America in his original comic books was just punching Nazis and doing the good guy justice all day. It was very Indiana Jones-esque, and Indiana Jones is another example of what I'm talking about. He's someone who's the wish fulfillment for the hyper-masculine man. It's fun, but it's not really deep. It only really satisfies this brief wish fulfillment without really any deeper self-examination. And if you like that, that's fine. I do too. I love Indiana Jones, but I much prefer, in general, what we're seeing more recently. Let's look at Captain America again. He's someone who in the last few depictions of some major films he's been in, he's left his government, fought with friends, questioned pretty much everything, and lost his American patriotic identity. His uniform has even shifted from this hyper-American, oh my gosh, look how awesome we are, reflection of who he is deep down, to a basically blacked out rogue agent type look, and I prefer that. It's really cool. But shifting away from the really cool aspect of it, it's a neat evolution of character. I don't think I could ever see Indiana Jones going through something remotely similar. He's always just going to represent this hyper-masculine, punch the Nazi type person, and with the most recent adaptation, it had many issues, but one of the few issues that stands out the most to me is it refused to adapt to modern character trends. Once again, Indiana Jones was just this Nazi punching, hyper-masculine, kind of dealing with some family issues, but in a way that wasn't very relatable and not very human. And the CGI monkeys didn't help. I also believe this kind of evolution of character morality and questioning can be seen in the evolution of how Superman is depicted on the screen as well. You have Christopher Reeve's adaptation, which in my mind will always be the true Superman, being this symbol of hope and super optimistic and polite and nice to everyone he sees. He is above it all. He never stoops to the bad guy's level. Then you have the modern Superman, Henry Cavill, who seems to be rather begrudgingly saving people, very dark, doesn't seem to relate to anyone around him, feels out of place. It's strange, and I believe that's because Superman has a very hard time as a character adapting to the modern viewing audience's expectation of what a character should be. Superman at his core is supposed to be this Superman, above it all, perfect and wish fulfillment to the extreme, to the point where relatability is almost entirely gone. Trying to make this modern Superman more relatable has really crushed certain aspects of his character, and while it's better in some ways, it just doesn't really meld well with the image and the idea of it. Now moving that to the wider discussion I was talking about at the beginning of this video, the evolution of morality. Again, this can be for the benefit or detriment of a character. I believe it's for the benefit of someone like Captain America. I think he's more interesting now than he was back in the 1940s. It's a little bit to the detriment of Superman. He has a hard time surviving in this more complex character world, but it doesn't mean it's better. I still think the previous Superman is superior over the modern one. Christopher Reeve's Superman forever. I'm taking this time just to absolutely make it sure no one is saying I'm saying you're wrong for liking Indiana Jones. I love Indiana Jones, but he's certainly not as nuanced as the modern character expectations want many people to be. Now let's shift this conversation more into modern fantasy, something my audience and myself am more comfortable in. The word Mary Sue is thrown around all the time when it comes to sci-fi and fantasy today. And that's because we as an audience seem extremely tired of seeing the overdone, hyper-perfect trope of the protagonist who gets the MacGuffin and fights the Dark Lord. And even if these are somewhat subverted and the character's given some flaw, if the character is not very relatable, they can be mislabeled as a Mary Sue altogether. And that's because we as an audience really want that relatability. To me, a character is much more likely to earn that label if they're always morally, unquestionably in the right, and they're smarter than everyone else in the room. I don't care if they get captured and tortured and hurt a little bit. That's fine. It makes them a little bit more human, give that die-hard appeal where you're actually seeing them get damaged. But to me, they could still absolutely earn that label if all the time they're just running around righteous and they're completely just the good guy. We want our bad guys to have a point that's strong enough to make our protagonists and us think about the consequences of what's happening. This has even gone to such an extreme that several stories now, including big blockbusters like the MCU, are putting out stories where it's just heroes fighting heroes. It becomes just an ideological battle. I am such a fan of this. I think it's so much more interesting than just having a Dark Lord who wants to end things. Obviously, this isn't meant for every story. Harry Potter, as the story it was, needed an ultimate bad guy like Voldemort. No one wanted Harry Potter to be sitting down from across a villain and having some kind of ideological debate. That's not what that was about. I'm not trying to preach this for every single story. What I'm saying is when it's appropriate and done right, it seems to resonate with a modern audience in a way that other stories really struggle to. I think the ultimate example of this can be seen in the difference between Brandon Sanderson's protagonist in the fantasy genre now and Tolkien's protagonist within Lord of the Rings. Now, I'm not saying Tolkien's protagonists were Mary Sues. In fact, many of them did have questionable actions, like Boromir, but they always either realized their fault or they just were always morally right to begin with. This is a bit on a spectrum. I'd say if a 1 was a complete Mary Sue and a 10 was a very flawed to the point of just utterly human, most of Tolkien's characters to me kind of range between a 3 to a 6. None of them seem to be wholly wrong. Many of them made a couple of errors. But if you compare that to Brandon, who's writing characters like Dalinar, Kaladin, Vin, people who really struggle with the society around them, what they should do to try and be in the right, and what the actual right side of things are, see Kaladin again and again for this example, they seem to fall much more in the range of 6 to a 9. Much more human, much more understandable, and the conflict will absolutely feel like something that exists in the real world. Now, as I pointed out in my Dear Authors world building video, just because something's more realistic does not mean it is always better for a narrative. Again, see Harry Potter. I think Harry Potter would have suffered quite a bit if Voldemort and Harry had some kind of relatability between them in ideology, and it was really just about some key differences. That's not what that story needed, and it's not what I'm preaching for everything. I want the characters' ideologies to clash when it's appropriate, and I think it's becoming more and more appropriate more often, especially for adult audiences. That's all I'm saying. Now, maybe an intended or unintended side effect of having these characters be more morally questionable even when they are the protagonist is a lot of the times the lines between the good and bad, the light and the dark, the Gondor and the Mordor, becomes more and more gray. There was no questioning in Lord of the Rings that Gondor was in the right, Sauron was in the wrong. Big surprise. I'm not spoiling anything. The guy's name is Sauron. But let's compare that to my personal favorite series, The Wheel of Time, something where the people in the light are often doing some of the most monstrous things in society. There are many characters within the White Cloaks who are serving the light, who are using their being in the light as a power advantage and abusing those around them who don't have that power. And there are many people in the dark side, in the shadow, that actually are extraordinarily relatable. One of the Forsaken went to the shadow because he logically came to the conclusion that if the Dark One was going to have an infinite number of chances, eventually he'll succeed. That's one of the reasons why I love that series so much. There's legitimate reasoning for everyone's choices where they stand. You know what characters believe and why. And even the main 6 or 7 characters stand in slightly different positions on key moral issues. We even see 2 of our main protagonists get in a physically violent fight with each other over the treatment of prisoners. I don't think Tolkien would ever bother to write a conflict where 2 protagonists get at each other's throats with weapons because the treatment of traitorous people as prisoners. He was much more concerned about wider themes concerning magic and technology. I'm not dismissing those themes. They're incredible. His idea of the entering the age of man and the death of magic was fascinating, and I loved it. It's one of the reasons Lord of the Rings to me is timeless. But I'm much more interested from a character perspective to listen to why Kaladin and Dalinar might not actually be the greatest, best people as protagonists, especially Dalinar. I love Dalinar. He's the most interesting character Brandon Sanderson's ever written, in my opinion. I guess for this Dear Authors video, I'm just more making observations rather than preaching a specific practice. If you want to go back to more the old time of writing protagonists, the Indiana Jones types, the Christopher Reeves type Superman, the Samwise Gamgees, who, oh my god, I love Sam. I'm not trying to diss him at all. That's fine, and it's great. But I think we as a modern audience certainly crave this moral ambiguity a bit more. And don't mistake that for me preaching grimdark. I think a lot of people are tired of morally gray equaling just dark and horrendous. Now, I myself am just now getting into grimdark, so I'm really enjoying it, and we'll explore it more in the future. But I get how that burnout starts. It's tiring at times. All these things are interconnected and interwoven. There's no right or wrong answer, but it was an interesting thought that Elliot put forth in our World Hoppers video, and it's kind of been infesting my mind. So I'm curious to see what your take on it is. Do you like the more complex moral questions that often our protagonists have to deal with now, or do you hearken back to a time when Superman was just undeniably in the right and he needed to go punch fat old Lex Luthor in the face? Do you like that ultimate wish fulfillment of Indiana Jones? I don't know. I mean, I miss kind of the old style a little bit, but I also really enjoy relating to modern protagonists on just a level that I find almost impossible to find in older media on a consistent basis. Now, I'm well aware people are going to pull from several examples of older fantasy, older sci-fi, what have you, of very flawed people. I'm aware that they definitely existed back in the day. And I'm not saying this is 100% the case. I'm just saying it's a trend. I think we are more likely now to see these incredibly flawed protagonists than we were back then. I just want to put that caveat in all this because I knew I was going to get that comment where someone listed like 5 examples of protagonists who are in that pre-Vietnam era who are like totally flawed and have all these moral problems. I'm aware it's been a thing. I'm not saying it's 100% case by case. All I'm saying is it seems to be more strongly emphasized now more than ever. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And let me know what you think, what you crave, what you want to see more of in your media. Do you want to see Captain America punch a Nazi, or do you want to see him question the United States government? I guess that's what this boils down to. Anyway, guys, have a great day. Peace.